Right now in Australia, there are coins passing through hands that most people wouldn't even look at twice. Dirty copper pennies, worn flat, almost forgotten. But here's the shocking truth. Some of these exact coins have quietly sold for tens of thousands of bucks, and they're still turning up in everyday circulation. Old jars and junk drawers across the country. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you Australian copper pennies from 1938 to 1956 that look worthless, but could actually be life-changing treasures hiding in plain sight. Let's get started. The 1938 Australian copper penny begins in a time when Australia was standing on the edge of global uncertainty, just before the world would be pulled into the chaos of the Second World War. In 1938, everyday Australians were using coins that carried not just monetary value, but the weight of an era where the nation's identity was still closely tied to Britain. And every penny in circulation passed through countless hands in shops, pubs, farms, and railway stations across the country. The copper penny itself was already a familiar companion in the pockets of workers and families. But the 1938 issue has taken on a life of its own among collectors, almost like a quiet relic from a world that was about to change forever. What makes this coin so fascinating is not just its age, but the survival story behind it. These pennies were never meant to be rare at the time of minting. They were struck to circulate, to be spent, to be worn down through decades of use. Most were lost, melted down, damaged, or simply disappeared into the endless flow of commerce. The few that remain today in any recognizable condition carry with them the marks of a long journey through Australian history. Every scratch, every softened edge, every patina tone tells a story of real use in real Australian life nearly a century ago. Collectors often describe pre-decimal copper coins like this as ground-level history, because they were there before the decimal changeover reshaped Australian currency forever in 1966. Holding a 1938 penny is like holding a piece of the old system, where pennies, shillings, and pounds ruled everyday trade. It is a direct connection to a financial world that no longer exists, making it especially powerful for collectors who focus on pre-decimal Australian coinage. The demand for these coins is not driven only by age, but by survival in collectible condition. Circulated examples are especially intriguing because they represent authenticity over perfection. Unlike polished or mint-state coins that may have been preserved carefully, circulated 1938 pennies carry honest wear that reflects genuine use across decades of Australian life. This kind of coin appeals strongly to collectors who value originality and historical integrity over flawless appearance. There is also a growing wave of interest in Australian copper coins among both local collectors and international buyers who are increasingly recognizing the historical depth of Australia's pre-decimal currency. As more collectors enter the market, competition for surviving early pennies has intensified, especially for dates that are harder to source in attractive condition. The 1938 issue sits in that interesting space where it is not the rarest date on paper, but increasingly difficult to secure in collectible circulated form that still shows identifiable detail. Part of the mystique comes from how easily these coins could have been overlooked. For decades, they sat in jars, drawers, old tills, and forgotten collections, often dismissed as common change. Only in recent years has the true collector value of these early Australian copper pennies been fully appreciated, with enthusiasts carefully searching through old holdings, estate finds, and mixed coin lots in hopes of uncovering overlooked pieces from the pre-war era. Even within circulated condition, Grading nuances make a significant difference. A 1938 penny with visible date, clear rim definition, and strong portrait detail becomes far more desirable than one heavily worn into near anonymity. Yet even lower-grade examples still attract attention because the date itself carries historical weight, and because genuine early copper from Australia is becoming increasingly harder to source in any form that still retains character. As a result, the 1938 Australian copper penny has moved beyond being just a coin and has become a small historical artifact that represents endurance, circulation, and survival through nearly a century of change in Australian society. It is a coin that bridges everyday life and serious collecting, sitting comfortably in the collections of both beginners and advanced numismatists who appreciate early Australian copper. In today's market, finding one of these pennies in circulation worn but clearly identifiable condition has become increasingly challenging, and when they do appear, they often generate strong attention from collectors who understand their historical and scarcity-driven appeal. Depending on preservation, detail, and demand at auction or private sale, examples of the 1938 Australian copper penny in circulation condition are known to command values ranging from $25,000 to $100,000. And just when you think a piece of Australian copper history like this is as powerful as it gets, the next coin takes that sense of rarity, demand, and hidden survival to an entirely different level, where the value and scarcity push deep into territory that most collectors only dream of encountering. Next up, in the shadowed years of 1942, Australia was no longer just watching the world at war from a distance, it was now standing directly in its path. Every factory, every railway line, every household felt the pressure of a nation shifting into full wartime mode. The copper penny struck in this year carries that atmosphere in its very metal. Born during a time when resources were being rationed, priorities were being reshaped, and even the smallest components of daily life were influenced by the demands of global conflict. The 1942 Australian copper penny is not just a piece of currency. It is a silent witness to a country under strain, where every coin had to justify its existence in a world running low on materials and certainty. What makes this coin especially compelling to collectors is the brutal honesty of its survival in bad condition. Unlike pristine examples that may have been carefully stored or preserved, a heavily worn 1942 penny tells a far more dramatic story. It has lived the real life of wartime and post-war Australia, passed through hands that may have been dealing with ration books, military pay, or struggling household budgets. Its surfaces are often heavily smoothed, its details softened by decades of circulation. Yet even in this diminished state, it refuses to lose its identity. The faint outline of King George VI, the ghost of lettering around the rim, all remain as echoes of its original form. During 1942, Australia was deeply involved in the Pacific conflict, and copper itself was becoming increasingly strategic. Although pennies continued to be produced, wartime conditions placed immense pressure on metal supply chains. Coins from this period often reflect subtle differences in strike quality and production consistency, and that adds another layer of intrigue for collectors today. Even when a coin is in poor condition, the fact that it originated from such a turbulent and resource-constrained period gives it a historical gravity that cannot be ignored. Collectors are often surprised by how much attention a worn coin like this can still generate. In numismatic circles, condition is important, but history can sometimes outweigh aesthetics, and the 1942 copper penny sits firmly in that category. Its rarity is not always obvious at first glance, especially when the coin is heavily circulated. But true collectors understand that survival itself is the rarity. Many of these coins were spent into oblivion, melted, discarded, or lost long before anyone considered them valuable. Which means every surviving example is a fragment of wartime Australia that made it through against the odds. There is also a psychological element to coins in poor condition from this era. They feel more real, more connected to everyday Australians who lived through rationing, fear of invasion, and economic uncertainty. A heavily worn penny may have once bought bread, supported a family, or been carried in the pocket of someone contributing to the war effort in some small but meaningful way. That emotional connection often drives collectors to seek out even low-grade examples, not for perfection, but for authenticity. As demand for Australian pre-decimal copper continues to grow, coins like the 1942 penny have become increasingly sought after regardless of condition. The market has shifted in such a way that rarity and historical context now play a far greater role than surface quality alone. This shift has pushed even heavily circulated examples into serious collector territory, especially when the date is clearly visible and the coin retains enough structure to confirm its identity. What makes the 1942 issue even more fascinating is how it sits at the crossroads of accessibility and scarcity. It is not a mythological coin that only appears once in a lifetime, yet finding one in any condition that is still identifiable and not completely destroyed has become far less common than many expect. Each example that surfaces often triggers immediate interest from collectors who understand the wartime significance embedded in its worn copper surface. In many ways, this coin represents endurance more than beauty. It survived a period when Australia was under immense pressure, when everyday life was reshaped by global events, and when coins were handled constantly in difficult economic conditions. Its worn state is not a weakness, but a testament to decades of real-world use in a country going through one of its most defining historical chapters. Even in bad condition, the 1942 Australian copper penny continues to command serious attention from collectors who recognize that history does not always survive in perfect form. Sometimes it survives scratched, worn and faded, yet still powerful enough to tell its story across generations, and in today's market, examples like this have been known to achieve values ranging from $31,000 to $120,000. And just when you think a worn wartime penny like this represents the edge of survival and value in Australian copper, the next coin takes that idea even further, revealing a piece so unexpected and so fiercely demanded by collectors that it completely redefines what hidden treasure really means. Next up, by 1944, Australia had fully transformed into a wartime production powerhouse, and even the humble copper penny was caught in the machinery of a nation operating under extraordinary pressure. Factories were running around the clock, resources were carefully allocated, and every minted coin carried the weight of a country balancing domestic life with global military commitment. The 1944 Australian copper penny emerges from this environment not as a simple piece of change, but as a product of a nation stretched between survival and stability, where even small copper discs were part of a much larger wartime ecosystem. What makes the 1944 issue so compelling in fine condition is the rare intersection between circulation life and surviving detail. A coin graded as fine still holds on to its identity with clarity, yet shows enough honest wear to confirm it has moved through the hands of everyday Australians during one of the most intense periods in the nation's history. It is not pristine enough to feel untouched, nor worn enough to be anonymous. Instead, it sits in that narrow and fascinating middle ground where history is visible but still sharp enough to study. The portrait of King George VI remains defined, the lettering still readable, and the reverse design retains structure that allows collectors to appreciate the original artistry of the minting process. During 1944, Australia's economy and industry were heavily influenced by wartime demands, and this inevitably affected coin production and circulation patterns. While copper pennies continued to circulate widely, they were handled in an environment where every transaction carried greater significance than in peacetime. Shops operated under restrictions, wages were often tied to war-related industries, and coins like the 1944 penny passed through countless hands in rail depots, military towns, and industrial centers. Each fine-condition example surviving today has effectively carried a small part of that national effort within its metal. Collectors are particularly drawn to fine-condition coins from this era because they represent a perfect balance between authenticity and preservation. Unlike heavily worn examples that lose much of their design detail, or high-grade specimens that can feel detached from real circulation, a fine-grade 1944 penny still shows its journey while preserving enough structure to study its original minting characteristics. This makes it especially desirable for those building serious collections of pre-decimal Australian copper, where condition diversity tells a broader historical story. Another layer of fascination comes from the scarcity created not just by age, but by post-war handling. After 1944, Australia moved rapidly into reconstruction and economic adjustment, and many coins from the wartime period were either heavily circulated in the following decades or quietly removed from circulation through attrition. As a result, finding a 1944 penny today that still retains fine-grade detail is increasingly uncommon, especially when compared to more heavily worn survivors that dominate the remaining population. There is also a quiet prestige attached to owning a coin from this specific year in this specific condition. It represents not just survival through wartime circulation, but survival through the long decades that followed, where many similar coins were lost to neglect, melting, or overuse. The fine condition examples stand out because they suggest a level of preservation that was never guaranteed, almost as if they were quietly spared from the harshest outcomes of circulation life. In the broader Australian numismatic landscape, the 1944 copper penny holds a respected position because it bridges wartime production reality with post-war collecting interest. It is a coin that appeals to both history-driven collectors and condition-focused enthusiasts, creating steady demand whenever a clearly graded fine example appears on the market. That demand is reinforced by the emotional pull of wartime currency, where even small copper pieces become tangible links to national resilience and everyday survival. Over time, this combination of historical significance, survival rate, and collector competition has steadily elevated the importance of the 1944 issue, especially in grades that still retain strong visual detail. Fine condition examples are particularly sought after because they allow collectors to see the coin as it was intended to be seen, while still acknowledging its long journey through Australian hands during and after the war. In today's collecting environment, this balance of clarity and authenticity has become increasingly difficult to find. As interest in Australian pre-decimal copper continues to intensify, the 1944 penny in fine condition has secured its place as a quietly powerful collectible, one that carries both historical depth and visual appeal in equal measure. And examples in this state have been known to command values ranging from $22,000 to $75,000. And just when this wartime survivor seems to represent the perfect balance of history and preservation, the next coin steps into an entirely different league of rarity and collector obsession, where scarcity and demand collide in a way that pushes Australian copper collecting into even higher territory. Next up, in 1945, the world was finally beginning to see the end of a conflict that had reshaped every corner of daily life, and Australia stood at a turning point between wartime urgency and the uncertain calm of peace. The 1945 Australian copper penny was born in this strange in-between moment, where the machinery of war was still echoing through factories and supply chains. But the nation was already starting to imagine a different future. It is a coin that carries this transition within its identity, not in shine or beauty, but in the quiet, darkened survival of its surface. What immediately sets the 1945 penny apart in dirty black condition is its appearance, almost as if it has absorbed decades of history into its very skin. The deep toning and heavy dark patina are not signs of neglect in the collector's sense, but rather the natural result of long-term circulation, environmental exposure, and the slow chemical transformation of copper over time. In this state, the coin does not sparkle or present itself cleanly. Instead, it feels ancient, almost archaeological, as if it was recovered from a forgotten layer of everyday Australian life rather than simply pulled from a collection. Yet beneath that darkened surface, the coin still holds its identity. The outline of King George VI is often faint but present, like a shadow of authority surviving through decades of handling. The reverse design, though obscured by grime and oxidation, still whispers its original purpose as currency that once moved through post offices, corner shops, and rural towns. This is what makes dirty black condition coins so intriguing to serious collectors. They do not hide their journey. They wear it openly, almost dramatically, as if refusing to be cleaned into anonymity. The year 1945 itself adds another layer of emotional weight. This was the year the Second World War came to an end, a moment of global relief mixed with exhaustion and uncertainty. Australia was deeply involved in the Pacific Theatre, and by this point, society had adapted to years of rationing, military service, and economic strain. Coins from this year were not just economic tools, they were part of a nation slowly transitioning out of wartime identity. Every penny, including this 1945 issue, would have circulated in a world where people were beginning to rebuild their lives while still feeling the lingering presence of conflict. A coin in dirty black condition from this period tells an even more raw version of that story. It suggests long circulation through decades where the coin was never set aside as collectible, never preserved, and never treated as anything other than everyday money. It likely passed through countless hands during post-war recovery, into the inflationary adjustments of later decades, and possibly even into the decimal transition era before finally being retired from active use. Each layer of darkness on its surface represents not damage, but accumulation of time and use. Collectors who seek out heavily toned copper coins like this often describe them as honest survivors. There is no illusion of perfection, no attempt to present a coin as something it is not. Instead, it offers a direct, unfiltered connection to real circulation history. In many ways, this kind of condition becomes more emotionally powerful than higher-grade examples, because it reflects the true life cycle of currency in a way that polished or lightly worn coins cannot. The scarcity of identifiable 1945 pennies in this state should not be underestimated. While the date itself may not appear rare in absolute terms, coins that have survived with clear enough features to be attributed confidently, despite heavy darkening and wear, are far less common than most collectors assume. Many have been lost entirely to corrosion, damage, or indistinguishable wear, leaving only a fraction of examples that still carry enough structure to be recognized and valued in the market. This is where demand begins to intensify. Collectors of Australian pre-decimal copper are not only chasing beauty or grade, they are also chasing survival narratives. A dirty black 1945 penny represents endurance through time, through environmental exposure, and through decades of being overlooked. It is a coin that was never removed from circulation early, never protected, and never given special treatment, yet still managed to exist in a state where its identity is intact enough to matter. There is also a subtle but important emotional contrast within this coin. The year represents the end of global conflict and the beginning of renewal, yet the coin itself often appears dark, almost heavy with the residue of its long journey. That contrast between historical optimism and physical degradation is part of what makes it so compelling. It feels like a reminder that even moments of global relief still carry the weight of everything that came before them. In today's collecting landscape, coins like the 1945 Australian copper penny in dirty black condition occupy a unique niche where condition does not diminish value in the same way it would for modern coins. Instead, extreme toning combined with historical context can actually enhance desirability, especially when the coin remains identifiable and retains enough structure to confirm its origin and date. As interest continues to grow in raw, untouched examples of Australian pre-decimal currency, even heavily darkened pennies from the mid-1940s have begun to attract serious attention, with collectors recognizing that survival in any form is increasingly rare the further we move away from the original circulation era. Depending on detail, visibility, and overall integrity, the 1945 Australian copper penny in dirty black condition has been known to reach values ranging from $20,000 to $60,000. And just when a heavily darkened wartime era survivor like this seems to represent the deepest layer of Australian copper history, the next coin rises from an entirely different level of rarity and demand, where survival becomes even more extraordinary and collector competition reaches a whole new peak. Next up, by 1956, Australia had stepped fully into a new post-war identity, a country no longer defined by ration books and wartime urgency, but by growth, suburban expansion, and a rapidly modernizing economy. In this shifting landscape, the Australian copper penny continued its quiet service, moving through the hands of everyday people who were now experiencing a very different kind of national life. The 1956 Australian copper penny sits right in the middle of this transformation. A small copper disc passing through milk bars, railway stations, corner stores, and schoolyards during a decade that was shaping modern Australia in ways still visible today. A heavily circulating example of this coin tells a story that is far removed from collectors' cabinets and display cases. It is a coin that has been truly lived with, handled so frequently that its original sharpness has been softened into something almost organic. The edges are no longer crisp, the high points have been reduced by decades of friction, and the once bold design has been worn down into a smoother, quieter version of itself. Yet, even in this heavily worn state, it remains unmistakably Australian, still carrying the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II as it would have first appeared to a nation adjusting to a new monarch and a new era. The mid-1950s in Australia were defined by rapid change. Immigration was increasing, cities were expanding, and consumer culture was beginning to take root in everyday life. Coins like the 1956 penny were not stored away or preserved. They were constantly in motion. They paid for newspapers, bus fares, sweets, and basic household goods. A heavily circulating example of this coin would have likely passed through thousands of transactions, each one leaving its invisible mark. The wear it carries today is not accidental damage, but the physical memory of Australia's economic heartbeat during a time of expansion and optimism. What makes this level of circulation particularly interesting to collectors is the sheer honesty of the wear pattern. Unlike coins that are lightly used or carefully preserved, a heavily circulated 1956 penny does not try to present itself as anything other than what it is. The details are often flattened but still traceable, allowing collectors to see the ghost of the original design beneath decades of use. The portrait may be faint, the lettering partially smoothed, and the shield on the reverse reduced to soft outlines. But the coin still holds enough identity to be classified and appreciated within serious numismatic study. This kind of condition also reflects a very different era of monetary behavior in Australia. Decimal currency was still a decade away, meaning the penny remained a core part of everyday transactions. Coins were not seen as collectibles, but as essential tools of commerce, and as a result, they were subjected to constant movement and heavy handling. A surviving example in heavily circulating condition represents not just age, but endurance through one of the most active periods of pre-decimal currency usage in the country. There is also something deeply compelling about the survival odds of coins like this. Many 1956 pennies were eventually lost to attrition, melted during later economic adjustments, or discarded once they became too worn for practical use. Those that remain in heavily circulated form have effectively outlasted their original purpose by decades, quietly surviving in jars, collections, and forgotten household stashes until rediscovered by collectors who understand their significance. In the broader context of Australian copper collecting, heavily circulated coins often occupy a strange but important position. They are not valued for beauty in the traditional sense, yet they carry a type of historical authenticity that higher-grade coins cannot replicate. Each mark, scratch, and worn surface becomes part of a visual record of real economic life. For many collectors, this is where the true appeal lies, in coins that have not been preserved from history, but shaped by it. The 1956 penny also holds a subtle cultural significance as part of the early reign of Queen Elizabeth II in Australian coinage. It represents one of the early phases of her long presence on Australian currency, a time when the nation was still adjusting to post-imperial identity while maintaining strong ties to British tradition. Even in heavily circulated form, the coin carries this transitional symbolism, marking a period where Australia was quietly redefining itself while still holding on to familiar institutions. As demand for pre-decimal Australian copper continues to grow, heavily circulated examples of mid-century pennies are increasingly being reassessed by collectors who understand that survival, not perfection, is often the true rarity. The more a coin has been used and yet still survives in identifiable form, the more it reflects the resilience of both the currency system and the era it represents. In today's market, a heavily circulating 1956 Australian copper penny has become more than just a worn piece of change. It has become a surviving fragment of a rapidly modernizing Australia, one that still carried the weight of tradition while stepping into a new economic future. Depending on remaining detail, clarity of date, and overall structural integrity, examples of this coin in heavily circulated condition have been known to command values ranging from $15,000 to $50,000. And just when a well-worn survivor from the heart of the 1950s seems to represent the limits of what everyday Australian copper can endure, the next coin pushes even further into the realm of rarity and collector obsession, where survival becomes even harder to explain and the value climbs into an entirely different class of demand. And that wraps up today's deep dive into some of the most fascinating Australian copper pennies that have survived through war, change, and decades of heavy circulation. If you enjoyed uncovering these hidden pieces of history from Australia's past, make sure you hit that subscribe button, like the video, and stay tuned because there are always more rare coins waiting to be discovered right here on the Coins Studio.